Once we leave the esophagus, we have entered the stomach. Many people mistakenly say that the major function of the stomach is to engage in the process of digestion. That is erroneous. Its main function is to act as a temporary storage tank for food. There are some exciting activities that occur in the stomach, which includes the formation of acidic chyme. Its main job, however, is to temporarily store food before that material moves into the small intestine, where the majority of chemical digestion and absorption will occur. Let's talk about the sections. And because my mouse and my computer screen are so sensitive, I'm not going to try and point these areas out, so please follow with me. We're going to go clockwise, starting with the fundus, which is the big bubbly part. It is going to sit tucked up against the diaphragm. The body is the main section of the stomach. Of course, the lumen is the area within the stomach. You'll notice that there are these spalls in the stomach wall that are marked, and those are known as rugae. They are part of the mucosa, and they are there because as you continue to eat, your stomach will fill and start to distend, and those folds will flatten out and allow you to consume a greater volume of food. You'll see along the convex area, or this convex side of the heart, and the concave side of the heart, there are going to be the greater and lesser curvatures. At the distal end of the stomach, you will see the pylorus, and in between the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine, and the stomach, you will see the pyloric sphincter. That is a ring of smooth muscle which will allow for the movement of chyme from the stomach into the small intestine. You will also see that there are going to be 3 layers of muscle in the stomach wall, within the muscularis externa. The other structures in the digestive system have, for the most part, have 2 layers, a longitudinal layer and the circular layer. However, the stomach is going to have an oblique layer also, and that's going to be important because it allows for extra mixing and churning of material in the stomach. So why do we want that? If the stomach is really just kind of a mostly temporary storage tank for food, why do we want to have mixing and churning? And that is because the contents of the stomach are going to be exposed to hydrochloric acid, because yes, indeed, the stomach will produce hydrochloric acid. That acid is going to be important because it will start to denature proteins, not only the proteins that you consume in your diet, also the proteins that are associated with pathogens that are attempting to invade you. Despite what we think, the food that we consume and the beverages we consume are not pristine and sterile. They do contain bacteria, and we want to make sure that bacteria is as disarmed and as denatured as possible. So they cannot damage us if they are associated with pathogens. Okay, so we talked about the greater curvature, we talked about the lesser curvature. We do need to talk a little bit about the greater and lesser omentum. The lesser omentum is basically going to connect the stomach from the lesser curvature up to the liver. So it kind of acts like a tether. The greater omentum looks like a sort of like an apron or a covering of the intestines, and it is going to be important because not only does it contain or hold fat, it doesn't contain fat so much, the fat will sort of drip off it, it'll drop off it, you'll see it on the next picture. Lymph nodes will also live there, and within the greater omentum, you will find pathways for blood vessels, lymph vessels, and nerves. So here's a picture. You can see the lesser omentum more superiorly, which is going to be in between the stomach and the liver. And the greater omentum is going to be a bigger structure, hence the term greater. And again, that is going to contain blood vessels, lymph vessels, nerves, and lymph nodes. There you have it. Now, the stomach is basically a J-shaped organ, but the shape can be pretty variable depending on what's in it. When it's empty, it's basically just a muscular tube. The lumen is constricted. When it's full, when you're over-consuming, it can hold up to 4 liters maximum. It's not something that I encourage people to do. We know that we swallow a bolus. That bolus will move down along the esophagus to reach the stomach. Once that bolus is processed within the stomach, it is now called chyme, and chyme sort of has the consistency of baby food. It is pretty acidic because the stomach is going to be producing HCl, and it's a combo of food, beverages, saliva, and the gastric gland secretions that we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. What a surprise! Autonomic nerve supply, and we know what the sympathetic division does, and we know what the parasympathetic division does. Blood supply will be from the celiac trunk. The gastric and splenic branches will arise from off the celiac trunk, and the stomach will be drained by the veins of the hepatic portal system. We already talked about the 3 layers of smooth muscle in that muscularis externa. There you have another diagram of that, and it tells you once again why that's important. The mucosa is simple columnar epithelium, and it will also have mucus cells. The mucus is going to be a bilayered coat. So the outermost layer will be sort of a thinner alkaline mucus, and deep to that will be a bicarbonate-rich, thicker mucus. And that mucus is going to be important because it protects the stomach walls from hydrochloric acid. And you want the mucus to contain bicarbonate ions because they will help neutralize the acid, again, as a protection mechanism so the walls of the stomach don't get burned or damaged by the acid. Mucosa will hold gastric pits, which will divide out into gastric glands, and those gastric glands are going to produce copious amounts of gastric juice. It shows you the pits. That shows you the glands that arise deep to the pits. Several different types of cells that you need to know. You need to know the mucous neck, the parietal and chief cells, as well as the enteroendocrine cells. And let's give a quick look at those. There's a list again, and here we have it. Again, the glands are in the fundus in the body, and those are the ones that are going to produce most of the gastric juices. The parietal cells are responsible for producing the HCl. And why do we care? Multiple reasons. We know that acid will denature proteins. That acid is also going to take the inactive form of pepsin, which is pepsinogen, and activate it into pepsin. That is an enzyme that's associated with protein digestion. HCl will also break down plant cell walls, and we know that it is going to kill pathogens. Yay! Parietal cells are also going to secrete the very important intrinsic factor. You need to have intrinsic factor in order to be able to absorb B12, so stay tuned on that. Sorry. The chief cells will secrete pepsinogen, and remember, it is the, as we just said up here, hydrochloric acid that is going to activate that pepsinogen into pepsin. It is a positive feedback mechanism, totally cool. And the chief cell will also secrete lipases, which are responsible for digesting maybe 15% of lipids. That shows you where the cells live relative to one another. And then we also need to talk about the enteroendocrine cells. They are going to secrete various chemical messengers into the connective tissue lamina propria. Remember that paracrine factors are going to be involved in cell-to-cell communication. Serotonin will inhibit the secretion of gastric glands. Histamine will help regulate acid production and reduces it. Actually, it increases it. Sorry, histamine will increase acid production. And the hormone somatostatin is going to inhibit gastrin release, and gastrin is a hormone that we're going to talk about here. So gastrin is going to stimulate the secretion of hydrochloric acid. It is also going to stimulate gastric motility, and I would know those two functions if I were you. 2-3 videos that are good to watch. Now, mucosal barrier. We've already talked about this, but let's talk about it again. The stomach has very harsh conditions because of the acidity of it. So we have those cells producing bicarbonate-rich mucus in order to protect the cell walls and the stomach walls. In between the epithelial cells, you're going to have tight junctions, which prevents the movement of material between those cells. And in addition to that, the turnover of epithelial cells is going to be PDQ, pretty darn quick. So within once or twice a week, the surface cells are going to be replaced. So probably a couple of times a week, you have new cells lining your stomach and in your gastric glands. We talked about the rugae. That's pronounced in various fashions. I learned it as rugae. And it's just folds of the gastric mucosa and submucosa. And you know that they're going to unfold and flatten to accommodate increased volume. Generally, the stomach volume is maybe 1.5 liters, but the theory is that it can hold up to 4. That's a lot. Couple of conditions. Gastritis is going to be inflammation. It's caused by anything that passes through that mucosal barrier. Peptic or gastric ulcers can be very painful, and they are erosions of the stomach wall. You can literally perforate the walls and end up with peritonitis, hemorrhage, and potentially this could be lethal. Most ulcers will be caused by H. pylori bacteria, sometimes by NSAIDs. They're usually triggered by bacteria. If you have a patient or know someone who has ulcers and they are taking an antibiotic for it, please make sure that they take the entire course of antibiotics, because, boy, you do not want H. pylori to become resistant to antibiotics. On the left, you can see an ulcer lesion, and on the right, amazing what you can see with electronic microscopes or electron microscopes. There's that H. pylori bacteria. So what actually happens in terms of digestive functions in the stomach? Mechanical breakdown. More particles will be broken down into, or larger particles will be broken down into smaller and smaller and smaller particles. We know that proteins will be denatured because of the low pH level. That includes food and bacteria. We will have some enzymatic digestion of proteins by pepsin, a little bit of fat digestion by lipases, and the chyme gets delivered to the small intestine. A few things can get absorbed through the stomach wall into the circulatory system, and that will include alcohol, because it's lipid soluble, and aspirin. The essential to life aspect of the stomach is production of intrinsic factor, because you absolutely need intrinsic factor to be able to absorb vitamin B12. And why do you need B12? Because you need to have erythrocytes, and B12 is crucial for maturing erythrocytes. If you have insufficient intrinsic factor, you end up with pernicious anemia. And currently, in this day and age, that does get treated with B12 injections. Here's a lovely picture of two pools. And why would I have that? Well, if you think back to the swimming pool picture, I have that photo earlier of the TC3 swimming pool. Yeah, because we secrete enough saliva to fill a swimming pool in our life. In this case, we secrete enough gastric juices to fill 2 swimming pools during the course of our life. How do we regulate gastric secretion? No surprise that they will be controlled by the nervous system and the endocrine system. We do secrete about, give or take, 3 liters of gastric juices each day. We know that if you have vagal nerve stimulation, that's parasympathetic, secretions will increase. Sympathetic stimulation will decrease gastric secretions. The hormonal control is largely through the actions of gastrin, which will trigger increased enzyme and hydrochloric acid secretion. Most of the small intestine secretions are going to be gastrin antagonists, and that is because you want to limit the amount of acid that is present in the small intestine, because you cannot have that heavy layer of mucus along the walls of the small intestine, because the small intestine has different functions, and you need to be able to pass material back and forth through the walls of the small intestine. There are 3 phases of gastric secretion. There's a video up there that gives you a lot more information, and you are welcome to watch that. This high-level description is what you need to know for this class. There are, like I said, 3 phases. The first is the cephalic phase. So it's basically a conditioned reflex that's going to be triggered when you think about or see or smell or taste food. The gastric phase lasts up to 4 hours. This is when sort of 2/3 of gastric secretions are going to be released. What triggers it? The distension of your stomach, peptides, low acidity in the stomach, and gastrin, which is going to increase the acidity of the stomach. That's probably the major stimulus. And then there are going to be these enteroendocrine cells known as G cells, which are stimulated by things like caffeine, peptides, and an increase in pH, which will in turn trigger more gastrin, which will in turn release more acidity and increase gastric motility. The last phase is the intestinal phase. That is a stimulatory phase, and that allows food, partially digested food, that chyme, to enter the small intestine. There will be a very brief period of intestinal gastrin release. That does not last long, and again, that is because you do not want highly acidic material within the duodenum or the jejunum, because you do not want to damage the walls of the small intestine. So gastric contractile activity, yes, because you do need to move material to the distal end, the pylorus. So your stomach will undergo these peristaltic waves. It may be a rate of about 3 waves a minute. And as your stomach becomes distended and gastrin levels increase, the force of contraction will increase. The contractions are going to be the most vigorous near the distal end, near the pylorus, and chyme will suffer one of 2 fates. initially. It'll either be delivered in very small spurts into the duodenum, or it'll be pushed backwards into the stomach where it'll get mixed and churned again. How do we regulate gastric emptying? So the chyme is entering the duodenum, and the duodenum will have these both stretch and chemo receptors that are going to respond to what's happening in it. So there are going to be sort of fates of the various macronutrients. Carbohydrate-rich chyme moves relatively quickly through the duodenum because the molecules are small and not a lot of processing needs to occur. Fatty chyme, and remember that triglycerides and fats tend to be more complex molecules, will remain in the duodenum for 6 or more hours. Interesting. Now, once we're in the duodenum, what happens? In the next section, we will move onward to find out what happens in the small intestine. Here's a hint. Majority of chemical digestion and the majority of absorption of macronutrients will happen within the small intestine. Nice lead in.